Hey everyone, thanks for joining our live Q&A session today. I hope that you're all having a good week so far and that you're keeping safe at the moment. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elle and I'm your Activities Officer for the next academic year. And I'm here today with Stefan and Maxine from the Careers Department, who are just going to quickly introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Stefan Vega and I'm a Student Development Advisor in the Career Development Service.
Hi, my name's Maxine and I am a Student Development Team Leader in the Careers Service. I'm going to talk today a bit about video interviews and about psychometric tests.
Cool, thank you both. We teamed up with the Careers Service to bring you live workshops, which we hope you'll find useful when planning the next step in your career. We all know that this is a really stressful time at the moment, especially during a pandemic. And so we've put these sessions on to try and ease any anxieties that you may have around job searching, applying for jobs, and then getting ready for that interview process. This session is open to all students at the university and it's a safe space for you to ask any questions. Please do just send in any that you have. There's no such thing as a silly question and we'll try and help you out. So today's session, we'll be focusing on preparing for online assessments. With the current climate, we know that a large majority of interviews will be taking place online. And so we want to support you in ensuring that you feel confident and comfortable in these settings. So today we'll be covering virtual assessment centres, psychometric testing and video interviews. So I'm going to pass on to Stefan and Maxine to discuss how the careers team can support you with preparing for these assessments. And then we'll move on to a 20-minute Q&A where you can ask any questions you may have. So Stefan, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Elle. So yeah, as Elle said there, we're going to be focusing today on the later elements of the assessment and kind of recruitment process. So in previous webinars such as this, we've spoken about applying for roles, CVs, cover letters, things like that. So today we're going to be focusing on those later processes such as video interviews, psychometric tests and assessment centres. So I'll be focusing on assessment centres and that will be the last one we go through. And Maxine will start off in a second with psychometrics and video interviews. And the main themes that we really want to get across to you guys today is in all of these stages, it's really important that you focus on research, preparation and reflection. And you'll see those as themes that we're going to cover in each of the different sections. Of course, there's more to the recruitment process than just these three stages. So again, if there are any other questions that you have, please do raise them in the Q&A and obviously we can pick those up in a second. So I'll hand over to Maxine, who will kick us off.
Great, thanks, Stefan. So the first thing I wanted to just give you a quick overview on before we move into the Q&A is the psychometric tests. And this is sometimes known as ability tests or aptitude tests or just online tests, basically. And these tend to come quite early on in the process, sometimes alongside or just after that first stage that Stefan mentioned of like a written application or a CV. And you might be asked to do them later as well, which I'm sure Stefan will mention when he talks about assessment centres. But essentially, what is this? Well, it's a way of an employer deciding if they think you have the right skills. It's quick and it's easy for them, which is unfortunately why they're becoming increasingly common, despite the fact that we know some people don't really like doing them. There's lots of different types of tests, but some of the most common ones that you might encounter are numerical reasoning, which tests your maths ability, logical or sometimes called inductive reasoning, which is sort of pattern recognition and pictures. There's verbal reasoning, which tends to be your reading comprehension. And also you might come across something called situation judgment, which looks at how you might respond in different working scenarios. So these are the most common. They're quite general, but some industries do use specific types of tests as well. And you'll probably know that if it's an industry you're looking at, but a bit of research will help you identify that as well. So one of the key things that I want to say, and I know Stefan's already alluded to, is the importance of practice in terms of psychometric tests. And the reason for this is not least the way that these tests are measured and assessed. So some people think that they have to do really, really well and get an amazing score of like 100% in order to do well on a psychometric test. But actually, that's not really the case. Typically, with these sorts of ability tests, you're being compared to how well either other candidates do or a kind of standard comparison group. And what that means is that actually a small improvement in your performance can make a big difference in what's called your percentile. So it can basically push you up a lot just to maybe get even one extra question right. And so practice there will really make all the difference. So often these tests are not really high level. So for example, with the numerical reasoning, the maths test, usually it's around GCSE level, which most people will have done. But the tricky thing is the way the questions might be asked, the fact that you might be behind, and that's very common. And also you may not have done this type of thing in a long time. So GCSE maths, I'm sure, unless you're doing a mathematical degree, you probably haven't thought about in years. So that practice will really help. And that will help improve your accuracy, but also your speed at doing the test, which is really key because typically you're being measured on both. So how quickly you can do the test in a particular time and also how accurate you are as well. If you're doing a sort of test that might be looking more at your working style or your personality, so for example, the situation judgment that I mentioned, practice is also really key there. Although there's not always necessarily one right answer, getting used to the style of the question is important. And again, coming back to that research, understanding what the employer is looking for is really important because you can try and demonstrate the sorts of skills and attributes that they might want. So that's really key. So how do you practice these tests? Well, the good news is that we have a resource that you can access. So we subscribe to something called Graduates First, and that is a big bank of psychometric tests. You can register to access these with your student email, and you can practice all the types of tests I've mentioned, plus more. And the great thing is that you get a really detailed results report. So you can see how well you're doing, you can see how you're balancing your speed and accuracy, and you can also see if there's particular areas that you need to work on. So that's where that reflection comes in. If there's something that's a weakness, maybe you're not very good at your percentages on a maths test, for example, you can do a quick brush up on that and a quick bit of revision, and that might just be what you need to improve that score. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop overview of psychometric tests. Obviously, if you have questions about anything I've said or more, then you can pop those in the Q&A. But I am now just going to move on to talk a little bit about what often comes next in the process, which is video interviews. So video interviews are different to a virtual interview where you're kind of interacting with someone live over Skype or maybe Zoom. A video interview is actually a pre-recorded interview. So typically you'll be seeing a question or a video of someone asking a question. You'll have a set time to respond. And then that will all be recorded. The employer will have some kind of software that does that. And then basically you'll be assessed on your performance and potentially progress to the next stage. Now, how to prepare for video interviews? Well, the most common mistake that people make is they don't treat it like a proper interview because it's not got another person there, because it comes quite early on. It's quite common that people don't really do the level of preparation they would if it was live or if it was face-to-face. But actually, you should really prepare in exactly the same way. Research the role of a course or whatever it is you're applying for, understand the skills that are needed, think about how you might answer questions around that using examples. We talked a lot about that in the application session that we did. And again, coming back to reflecting on that performance, and I'll talk a bit in a moment about how you can do that. So that preparation is really key. What I would say is there are a few extra considerations with a video interview to think about. So one is your visual environment. Obviously, I'm in my house. You can see I've got personal items around me, and that's fine, of course, but you want to just make sure there's nothing inappropriate, so nothing like offensive in the background or no dirty laundry hanging around. You know, be mindful of your environment. And think about the noise as well. So if you live with other people, you might want to warn them you're going to be doing your video interview, so they don't start shouting your name. And also think about looking professional. So like any interview, you want to make sure you're perhaps dressed professionally, at the very least from the waist up, so that visually you can give that nice professional look as well. Now, unfortunately, a lot of students have said to me that they really hate video interviews, actually more than face-to-face interviews, because you don't have another person there to react to or get a rapport with, and that can be challenging. It is difficult, but what I would say is there are some benefits to a video interview as well. So, for example, often when you're given the question, you're shown the question, you've given a bit of thinking time, which doesn't happen when it's live. So you've got a bit of time to process. You also can use notes, which isn't really acceptable in a kind of face-to-face interview setting. One thing I will say with that is, if you are going to use notes, do try to be subtle. So try not to be looking down, reading your notes while you're talking, and also rustling papers as well. So just think about the benefits of the video interview, I guess, as well as those challenges, which we do accept are true. I mentioned not looking down at notes. So that's really important when you're doing a video interview, to try and make it feel natural, even though it isn't. So, try to look into the camera. That's like the equivalent of making eye contact, and try and be enthusiastic and energetic, even though there isn't someone there to kind of respond to. Now, like with the psychometric test, we have some resources that can help you prepare for video interview. We have a software called Launchpad, which is actually used in real recruitment settings. And you can access this and you can do a video interview to just get a feel for what that is like, get a bit of practice, and you can reflect on and get some feedback on that as well. So we have an appointment that we offer where you can reflect on your video interview performance, go through that with an advisor, talk about the experience, and then see how to improve for the real thing. So that is something that we can offer you. And again, if you've got questions about any of those elements, you can raise them in the Q&A as well. So before I hand over to Stefan, I'll just say that all of those things I've mentioned, the Graduates First for Test and the Launchpad, can be accessed on our website if you go to the interviews and assessments section. And if you go to the appointments and workshops section, you can book any of those appointments that I mentioned. And you can also see that we have workshops around things like interview preparation and psychometric testing as well. So there's lots on there to support you. I'm now going to hand back over to Stefan, and he's going to talk to you about virtual assessment centres. Over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Maxine. So yes, following on from those other elements of the recruitment process, quite often the last stage, or at least one of the very late stages, is an assessment centre. Now some of you might have come across that term before, for some it might be new. You might also hear it as an assessment day. So really what an assessment centre is, and I'm going to talk in the more traditional sense before I start to talk about virtual versions of these, is that an assessment centre is a way for a recruiter to start to see you kind of in context of the role you'll be working in. So if you think about the CV that you put in your application form, it's a lot about you talking on paper about the things you're good at and the skills you've got and the experience you've had. Maybe they'll have seen you in an interview, whether it's virtual or not, like a video interview or not. So by the stage you get to an assessment centre, the recruiter has a really good idea about you, but it's really a chance for them to start to see you putting all of those skills and experience into practice. Now, an assessment centre is made up of lots of different activities quite often. So more often than not, the kind of main element of an assessment centre is a group scenario or group discussion stage, where you'll be put together in a small team or group with other people who are on the day to be assessed, and you'll be working together, maybe reading through a case study, working on a problem. Quite often there might be a bit of role play involved, so maybe they might say, well, you're a team, you are now part of the graduate group who's just joined the company. Here's your first day, here's your first problem. You have to provide a report back to the CEO or someone like that later on. So there can be a little bit of role playing there. And again, the idea is to see you in context. There are also other elements. So as Maxine kind of said before, even though you may have already done some psychometric tests, you might have already done an interview, sometimes they may want to do those again as part of the assessment centre, or if you've not had those before, they might bundle it all together into one package. So you'll come onto the day, you'll start off with some psychometric tests, around lunchtime you might do some networking, then do the group discussion, and then finish off in the afternoon with an interview. So it can involve quite a lot of different tasks. Now, obviously, with current circumstances, face-to-face versions of these aren't really possible. So what a lot of companies have done is turn these into virtual assessment centres, and quite, understandably, some stages or some elements have been removed. But they're still doing stages or elements such as that group discussion. So you might be on a video conference call with several other prospective kind of people going for the day as well. And you might have to work together virtually towards a certain task or be presented with a certain problem. And you might still have to do a presentation. I think some students have thought that, oh, well, it's virtual, I won't have to do a presentation anymore. Whether or not you like those, but a lot of companies are still using presentations in some way or another, again, to see you and those different skills you might have. So to be able to really do well at assessment centre, the main advice I can give you is make sure you prepare and research in advance. You know, what's the company like? What are their values? What skills they're going to be looking for? So don't forget, by this stage, you'll maybe have already written an application, a CV, done some psychometric tests and interviews. So you will have already done some research. So don't forget about that. Make sure you bring all that in. And that's why in a previous webinar, we spoke about how the more research you do at the beginning and the more kind of thorough that research is, the better it will help you through later on in the process. So understanding as you're going through to the group element stage, okay, what skills are the employer looking for here? Well, teamwork, maybe some leadership, maybe some problem solving. How can you show those skills? How can you really, what does teamwork actually mean? You know, if I'm just doing a load of talking and not letting anybody else talk on the day, does that show my leadership, or does that show that maybe I've not got great teamworking skills? Yeah, and quite the opposite, you know, it might feel like it's a competition, but the company might be recruiting more than one person from your group. So, you know, you don't want to shut people out or worry that they're talking more than you, because they may one day be your colleagues. Okay, so actually helping them to, you know, come into the conversation if they're a little bit more nervous, trying to get other people's ideas. Those are all going to show your really brilliant teamwork and communication skills. Now, it can be quite tricky to actually practice these, but we actually do run some mock assessment centres which are being done virtually at the moment. So you can book your place in those. We run them fairly regularly every few weeks, so just make sure you check out My Careers to book on to those. And we also do have some career coaching appointments if you wanted to just have a bit of reflection and maybe either chat about one you've already had and how it went, or maybe if you're preparing for one coming up and you just want to ask a couple questions. So I've kept that quite brief because I appreciate there's some time for questions at the end. So if there are any more specific questions about assessment centres, hopefully we can pick them up in a second. So I think I'll hand back to Elle.
For sort of giving us all that information and highlighting how careers can support students at the moment. So we'll get stuck into the Q&A, so feel free to send in any questions you do have. They don't necessarily have to be about something that Stefan or Maxine have already covered. Feel free to just ask whatever. We've got a few. So the first one we'll go with is, how do I know what employers are looking for in my assessment centre? And I will pass that one over to Stefan.
Thanks, Elle. So yeah, picking up a bit more of, I guess, what I was just talking through. So it really comes into that research element. So again, when you're looking and preparing for your assessment centre, you know, you can look on websites such as Glassdoor, which might have kind of testimonies from people who've been to the assessment centre with that company before. They might talk about their experiences. More often than not, companies will actually tell you in advance what elements you can expect on the day. So if they tell you there's going to be a group element stage, you can already start to think, okay, what skills am I going to need to highlight there? If they tell you there's going to be an interview, you know, is there going to be a prepared topic in advance? So it's really making sure you've understood that. You know, look back through the job description and the person spec if they've given you one. They don't always, but if they have, that will give you an indication about some of the skills they're going to be looking for. And quite often you can almost use that as a bit of a tick list and say, well, I know they've kind of looked at these skills in the psychometric test and they've looked at these in the interview, but they haven't really been able to assess my team working. So probably it's something I need to show at the assessment centre. So really to stand out and kind of make the most of it, it's really making sure you do that research. And again, I'll repeat what I said before. Don't forget, you've probably already done quite a lot of research before you get to that stage. So make sure you kind of go back and use it.
Oh, thank you. I guess maybe following on from that, with that sort of tick box approach, how would you recommend someone stand out at an assessment centre?
Yeah, sure. So I can take that one again. So again, I think when we talk about standing out in assessment centre, what most people think about is that group element stage. You know, the teams can vary in size. It could be a fairly small group. It could be 8-10 people in the group. So, you know, and again, everyone's there. Everyone's a little bit nervous. Everybody kind of wants to make sure they're heard. And it's really important that you do participate in these group element stages. And you don't just kind of sit back, you know. maybe you've been given the role of timekeeper. Don't make that the only thing you do. Make sure you do contribute. And sometimes people think, oh well, I don't think I have anything to say, or I feel like I've not really got anything I can input here. But it's not always about that kind of contributing. Standing out again could be showing those brilliant skills like team working. So maybe you notice that somebody is doing a lot of talking and they're kind of not letting anybody else speak, but you can see that somebody else is really wanting to speak up. So maybe you can find the opportunity to say, oh, that's a great point. Whoever's been talking, I wondered what you thought, to somebody else. So you can kind of be that person to divert the conversation and open it up. And that in itself is a really brilliant skill. So even though you might not have necessarily said anything yourself, that can be a really good way to stand out in an assessment centre and kind of show those skills that you've got. But obviously, if you can contribute, if you do have any relevant knowledge or anything, bring that out and highlight as best you can. And again, the more you prepare, the better you'll do. And so, again, I mentioned earlier those kind of 3 elements: the research, preparation, and reflection. When you've been to an assessment centre, or if you've had one before, make sure you reflect on it. What went well? How could I have stood out more at that time? What was the feedback the company gave me, if any? So yeah, really important to remember that kind of broad range of not just the one who talks the most.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we've gone about online tests. So how can I improve my speed and accuracy in online tests? And we'll go to Maxine.
Great, thanks, Elle. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that you're sort of being assessed on speed and accuracy in these sorts of tests. So, how can you improve those, and also importantly, get a balance? That's really important. So we keep coming back to it, but we will practice is so important. I mean, that will help you on both fronts, but speed in particular. I know, like, the first time I saw a psychometric test, I had no idea what I was looking at, and it was just very confusing. And I've had students come to me with the same experience. They sort of thought, you know what, I'll just go for it. They dive right in, and they were like, whoa, wasn't expecting that. So actually just getting used to the way that they're structured, the way questions might be presented. And once you're invited to a psychometric test, you'll at least know, hopefully, if the employer's nice, what sort of test it might be. So you can do, again, a little bit of research into it, and that will help you know which ones to practice beforehand. So in terms of the speed, that's really key. Accuracy, I kind of mentioned before that the resource we have, Graduates First, gives you that detailed report. And that's really important because sometimes, again, people will be really keen on that practice element, and they might do loads and loads of tests, but they don't actually always look at the results of the test. They just say, oh, I didn't do very well, I'll do another one. Which, is all well and good, but actually you're probably doing pretty well on some elements and worse on others. So if you can identify where you need to practice, whether there is one particular type of question that keeps throwing you, you can then focus just a little bit of revision on that rather than spending ages doing like the whole test over and over. And that will really help you on that accuracy point. It is a balance though, you're not always going to be able to answer every question. And you're not always going to be able to answer every question correctly. How often do we get 100% on a test? Very rarely. So the employer will be interested to see how you've approached that as well. They're looking at the time management skills. So if you spend, half of your time on one question and then had to rush through the others, it doesn't reflect very well. So try and get a bit of a sense of like, well, okay, if I've got 10 minutes to answer 10 questions, roughly that's a minute each. If you are spending a really long time on one question and it's really throwing you, skip it or guess if you have to. You might be able to come back to it, but even if not, that might be okay. So do try and think about that balance. A couple of tips for different types of tests. So with numerical, the maths test, obviously looking at your results report and seeing which areas you've got right or wrong is important. But something like BBC Bite Size, you might remember from your GCSE days, you can go to that just to refresh and revise some basic maths if you need to. Something like a verbal reasoning, where you're actually looking at a bit of text and then answering a question about it. A really common mistake people make there that reduces their accuracy is bringing in their own assumptions if they've got knowledge about the topic. Remember, the whole point of verbal reasoning is using what's being given to you. And in terms of the logical or inductive reasoning, which is those patterns that loads of people tell me they hate and they find them really stressful, they are about practice, but also breaking the patterns down into individual components. And that's something that you get used to the more you do them. So if you've got some weird, bizarre shapes that are rotating and changing colour and moving position, try and break that down into the individual elements, and that will make it easier to see the patterns. So that's just a couple of tips for sort of accuracy, but generally, you know, that practice and reflection will help, and just trying to get a balance is really key as well. And with any of this, come and talk to us if you've got questions or if you're worried. You know, we run appointments for all these different things, so you can always talk it through with someone if you're getting a bit stuck on your own. Pass back to Elle now for our next question.
So we've got a question that's been voted up. So this one is, how is a virtual assessment centre different from one that is face-to-face? And I'll be passing back to Stefan for that one.
Great, so it's a really interesting question, and I've kind of touched on it, but so I guess with the virtual element of the assessment centres now, some stages might have been removed. So potentially before, where there might have been like some sort of activity, or like like it's called like an intro exercise where you might have to work on lots of different things. Some of those might have been removed. They might be shorter because obviously, you know, with a in-person event, you can kind of go on a break, do some networking lunches and things like that. So some of those activities might have been taken out. So the overall experience might be a bit shorter. Think about that networking element's a really good point though. So, you know, there might normally be networking lunches, opportunity to just cross the room and shake hands with somebody. Obviously that's not going to happen now, but you can still network in that virtual environment. So some things are the same. And also another important thing to think about is, how do you feel talking to a camera, right? It is surprisingly different to you know, just talking to somebody face to face, especially if you're trying to maintain some good eye contact. Just staring into the lens can be a bit disconcerting for some people. So in preparing for a virtual assessment centre, it's also important that you prepare for this kind of whole virtual working. You know, make sure your technology works, make sure you've done some practice, potentially talking into the camera. So Maxine mentioned Launchpad before, which is what we recommend for video interviews. But I would also recommend that those people who might be going for an assessment centre virtually also kind of take a look at that platform, because it does give you an opportunity to practice talking to a camera, and you can also look back to see, you know, do you look natural doing that, or you know, so it can give you some insight into yourself. But yeah, again, just take a look and see what advice the company's giving in terms of whether there's anything going to be drastically different for their virtual provision.
Perfect. You've actually answered the question that we had about what other activities that we might expect at a virtual assessment centre. So I'll move on past that. We've got a question on, if a student usually gets extra time in exams or during tests, is it possible for them to get extra time to complete a psychometric test? So Maxine.
Great, thanks, Elle. Just broke up a tiny bit there, so I'll just repeat that in case anyone didn't hear. It was just if you're an individual that normally gets extra time when they're doing like a test or a uni exam, if you can get that in a psychometric or online test as well. So the short answer is yes, you should be able to get that. During the recruitment process, the employer should ask you if you require additional adjustments in various parts of the process. So it wouldn't necessarily just be for psychometric tests. For example, there might also be adjustments at the assessment centre stage as well, or interview stage. But in terms of the online test, it is something that people do get quite concerned with. And usually when they invite you to do a test, there will be something typically in the email that might say, you know, if you haven't already let us know, do you require any adjustments? Now, obviously, whether you disclose that to the employer is entirely at your own discretion. That's a very individual and personal thing. So we would always say, you know, that is your own individual choice. But, you know, ultimately, it's about making sure that you have a really fair opportunity in that process. And it's the employer's responsibility to give you as fair a chance as any other individual in the process. On the rare occasion that you're not given that opportunity, it might well be that it's because, for example, there isn't a time limit to the test. So sometimes if you're doing something that's more of like a personality type assessment, there isn't always a time limit, and therefore adjustments don't make a huge amount of difference in terms of timing. But you know, if you're concerned, it's always worth asking. And typically that will either come in the form of additional time if it is something that's timed, or if it's not that you're given longer to do the test, sometimes the way the results are calculated is a little bit different. So yeah, just coming back to what I said before, the short answer is yes, adjustments are typically offered, and if you would feel comfortable disclosing to an employer about requiring those, they should really be able to use that to make the process fair for you. But again, like I keep coming back to, if it's something that you're worried about or you're not sure how to broach it, do come and talk to us about that, because that is a common query we get, and it is something that employers are very used to dealing with.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to the last question, just noticing the time. So how should I prepare for a video interview? Is it different to a face-to-face or a Skype interview? Maxine, we'll go to you.
So essentially, you should treat it like any interview. The way that you prepare, whether it's in person, whether it's pre-recorded or otherwise, should really be always the same. Obviously, there's the technical elements and the kind of visual elements which both Stefan and I have touched on. But just to recap about preparing for interviews, it is something that I think might have been covered in other Q&As, but just to clarify, you know, make sure that you go in, like Stefan said, with a really good understanding of what you're applying for. Might seem obvious, but people don't always remember if they're making lots of applications. Research the organisation, try and predict what you might be asked and prepare answers. That's a really key one. It's not about learning a script or, you know, having a list of things that you can say, you know, very robotically. You want it to be natural, but we all know it's really hard when you're put on the spot to come up with specific examples and scenarios. And that is really important for interviews, being able to draw on your experiences and give examples. So just thinking about, okay, what skills or attributes are they looking for and might they ask me about, and what examples can I give of those? Thinking about that in advance will really help you just be able to quickly pull on them in the video interview. And you might be asked as well about your motivation. So like, why do you actually want the job or the place on the course or whatever it might be? And again, that research, anything that you know about the company or anything you know about the job will help you to answer that in a more specific way and a way that's more tailored. So really just try to approach it like you would any other interview. Again, we have an interview preparation appointment. So if you're a bit unsure about how to prepare or you want to kind of run your ideas by us, you can book in for one of those. And then we have obviously Launchpad, where you can practice doing the video interview, or you can just do a more sort of standard mock interview if you just want to sort of go through your answers with someone in a live setting. So there's lots of opportunities there to practice. And the other thing, just final thing to remember, is sometimes they will give you some guidance on what kind of interview it will be. I see that quite commonly with video interviews. They might actually say this is going to be a skills-based interview, or we will ask you about why you're interested in the role. So, you know, sometimes you've got a nice employer, they'll give you some hints there, and that will really help you to focus your preparation as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess all that leaves me to say is thank you for attending today's session. We hope that you found it helpful and it's given you some practical tips to take away. A huge thank you to both Stefan and Maxine. It was great to have you, and it was really nice to hear all of the advice and support that students can get from careers. If you do have upcoming online assessments and would like more advice, please do reach out to the careers team and visit the link on the screen, I think there, or maybe that's ours. So we'll be holding more sessions, so please keep a lookout on the Leicester Union website to see what's coming up. Good luck everyone with your next steps, and remember that the careers team are here for you even when you've graduated, so make the most of it. And if you've missed any of our previous workshops, you can catch up on the Leicester University YouTube channel. Have a great rest of the week and a great weekend, and thank you both for joining me today.